Welcome to Doctors Rating Trends. This is a show where two Ivy League trained doctors take a look at the latest medical trends of today and try and figure out what's real and what's not. In a world where you're constantly getting inundated with BS, it's hard to know where the actual truth lies. So what we do is we take each side of the subject. One goes positive, one goes negative. We do all of the literature search that we can so that you can make the best decisions. By the end of it, you should have both sides of the topic pretty much nailed.
Today, we're going to talk about beta-alanine. For a long time, this has been known as a supplement for people that do high-intensity workouts. Lately, though, there's been a lot of literature saying that it has other benefits as well. So Jess is going to take the pro, I'll take the con side, and we'll see where this comes out in the end.
Let's get into it. Beta-alanine hit the scene about 4 years ago when a guy named Matt Fraser went on to the Joe Rogan podcast and said that it gave him a third lung. The reason why this is important is because Matt Fraser at the time was deemed to be the fittest man in the world 5 times running. He's involved in a sport called CrossFit, which is known for its extreme high intensity and requiring you to be able to get into the lactic acid zone over and over and over again. After he said this, the sales for beta-alanine absolutely skyrocketed. So what is beta-alanine and where does it come from? Beta-alanine is known as the performance-enhancing amino acid. It's a non-essential amino acid found in vitamin B5, and it's precursor to something called carnosine. More about that in a minute. But where can you find this magical amino acid? It's in meat. And bottom line, if you're trying to look for a reason why meat eaters may or may not have an advantage over vegetarians and vegans, alanine would be one of the things that you point to. Any source of meat, whether it's fish, beef, or chicken, will increase your levels of carnosine. And to show that this is the case, 50% less carnosine exists in vegetarians and vegans on average. So why is carnosine important? Carnosine is this third lung that Matt Fraser was talking about. Basically, what it is it runs around and removes lactic acid from your muscles. Lactic acid is the byproduct that builds up when you take the intensity of your workout so hard that you actually go into something called anaerobic exercise, which means that you're now burning energy sources that don't even have, oxygen. You've gone past your oxygen limits and suddenly you start creating this lactic acid. Lactic acid buildup is what causes the burn in the workouts and ultimately is what limits performance in people that are trying to do high intensity. So if you increase your carnosine that's running around and removing the lactic acid, are there real benefits or is this something that you can just sort of work through because it helps with the burn? So this has been studied intensively now. First benefit that came out is exercise performance. There have been a number of different studies that have shown that for folks who take exercise into that lactic acid zone, this has a major benefit. This particular study was taking a look at bike riders running around the Alps. So folks that do things like the Tour de France took beta-alanine for about a week at high doses, and then they compared it to a group that didn't take the beta-alanine, and there was a performance-enhancing effect. So it did make them more capable of going faster for longer when they actually took the beta-alanine. And this was just after 1 week. So there might be some other benefits that people are thinking about with this, but the main one that this has been known for was exercise performance. So they decided to go and scientists thought, well, what else could this thing do? Took a look at soldiers and started putting beta-alanine into the soldiers in clinical trials to see if it actually improved things like cognition after a long stretch of exertion. So this is really important, especially if you're a tier 1 operator or anyone on the front lines who's been running around, absolutely getting exhausted, and then you have to think at the highest level tactically about the next step. So they put beta-alanine into a group and then had a control group and saw how they performed after they really stressed themselves out and worked out really hard. And what they showed is that there was actually a benefit in cognitive function in the soldiers that were under stress and under fatigue. What's interesting about this study is that it showed that there is an improvement for those that were under stress and fatigue, but if it was fatigue only, then you didn't see much of a benefit. So it turns out that if you put this into somebody who actually has to make decisions and you're shooting at them or yelling at them while they're stressed out, they were able to do better after beta-alanine. So given the fact that this has positive cognitive function, people decided to also take a look at situations where there's cognitive decline. namely in aging. So beta-alanine was given to a variety of different elderly folks to see if this improved their thought processes. And lo and behold, it did have a positive effect. But what was interesting is it had a positive effect on the folks that were showing decline for their age. If you put it into normal people, it actually didn't improve their cognition at all. But if you put it into people that were lower than average for their age, it brought them up. Not only did it improve their cognition, but it also improved their depression and mood. Now, it could be that the confounding variable here is that it improved their mood because their cognition was working better, as opposed to improving their mood because of some process with their dopamine or serotonin pathways. But that still needs to be worked out. Regardless, it improved people who were showing a decline in cognition. So now let's take a look at some of the other potential things that it can do, because they've gotten really excited about, and when I say they, I'm talking about the scientific community in general, has gotten really excited about some of the other potential things that this can do. And so it's been studied extensively in rodent models and shows it has very powerful anti-inflammatory effects, neuroprotective effects, and potentially other anti-aging effects. One particular study that showed that it improved cognition after stroke in rodents. So after you have a stroke, which is a clot that goes up into your brain and it takes out the blood supply to that part of the brain, you get this massive inflammatory response, basically your body reacting to the damage, and that inflammation will actually cause further decline. And if you have something that blocks that and blocks the ischemic processes like the acid running around, like increased levels of carnosine, then it can protect your brain in the case of stroke. So it makes sense from a scientific standpoint. So now we're going to move into discussing what downsides there are, if any, for this.
It turns out there are not a lot of side effects with beta-alanine. One of the things that you can find in the literature is that sometimes people will experience tingling when they start taking the supplement. One of the ways to get around this is taking an extended release beta-alanine or starting at a lower dose and gradually working your way into normal dosing from there. If you do experience tingling, it lasts for about 60 to 90 minutes and goes away. And if you've been taking beta-alanine for a long time, it's not an issue anymore. Turns out that pain is one of the suggested side effects of taking beta-alanine. One study I could find on this was extremely poorly designed. They took 20 people, they put them on a half-a-mile hike in Arizona, and it took them an average of 8 minutes, so none of them really hit a lactic acid threshold. They also, in the same study, were looking at connectiveness with nature on top of looking at the effects of beta-alanine. And when they did rate their pain, they told the patients to look at tingling as a potential cause of pain. So when they were looking at these pain scores and they were in their 2 or 3, it wasn't necessarily pain, it was just tingling. So I couldn't help myself. When I saw connectedness to nature scale, I had to do a deeper dive on this because it was actually in a scientific paper. Turns out that this is used frequently in these junk journals, and what they're looking at is how you feel about nature. And they found a survey of 14 questions that you take before and after you walk through nature. One of the questions is, I feel that all inhabitants of Earth, human and non-human, share a common life force. Another question is, I often feel like I am only a small part of the natural world around me, and that I am no more important than the grass on the ground or the birds in the trees. I'm not sure what the hell this has to do with science. When you look at this and it's actually published in a peer-reviewed journal, it calls into question the journal, which in this case is the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. It makes me want to see all of the articles published in that journal through a lens of this can't possibly be science. So needless to say, I wasn't real impressed with any of the studies related to pain that might be caused by beta-alanine.
So connectedness to nature is clearly something that we're not going to be looking into in any future episodes, but it is interesting how much people go to a stretch to find anything wrong with beta-alanine. This is one of the few supplements out there that seems to have a lot of real upside. And I was really impressed not only with the quality of the studies, but the fact that they were able to be repeated and that they showed very, very strong signals from study, basically investigators that have absolutely no conflict of interest. So the Israeli army, for instance, isn't trying to push beta-alanine, on the side as a supplement. So it's really good to see that these different groups can come out and show that it not only has really powerful benefit for cognition and, depression potentially in elderly people, but also able to repeat that it actually is quite good for high intensity exercise.
There are two things I look for when I look at studies now. One is, does it make sense? And two, is the study really well done? And the studies that we found on beta-alanine cover both these. The studies were extremely well put together. The tier data was as good as you could ask for with the supplement. And all of the studies, even though they cover different, they all seem to fit the same mechanism of action. So it made sense that it worked where it did in all of these studies. Like you said, there wasn't any bias. Israeli military is not looking as a potential investor in beta-alanine. They just want what works the best in their special forces. And so you saw a lot of different sources with very little bias that were coming up with the same answer. So on every level, it seemed like the science was as good as you could ask for. In terms of downside, a lot of people talked about the tingling. On a side note, with regards to the pain study, this goes into a pet peeve of mine when people talk about peer-reviewed journals. Peer-reviewed means that your peers reviewed the journal. And what this does when you see crap science like this is it calls into question your peers. I could go out onto a playground and say that hugs will cure cuties. And if I got two people that were running the playground to say, well, yeah, we agree with that and write it in the dirt, you could call that a peer-reviewed study. So it really highlights the fact that there is a lot of junk science out there now.
And again, when taking a look at this, it's so rare for us to take a look at a supplement and actually see that taking more of that supplement makes you better. And normally it's getting up to your baseline if you're deficient is what actually sends a signal up and makes something look like it works. And then people who are normal take it thinking that they're going to be superhuman, and that's just not the case. So most of the time when you're taking supplements, you're just making your urine really expensive. In this particular case, it actually does increase your performance. And it's something that builds over time too. When you look at the studies and people that are taking this over the course of a month, you can see your performance improve as you take more of this. And there's very little downside to it. One thing I would say, though, is that this is for people who are either low performers, as in the case of elderly folks with their cognition, or for high performers. If you're running normal and you don't want to push yourself into any situation where you're going to get lactic, then you're not going to see much of a difference from this. At least from the studies that we've seen, there's nothing to indicate that this is going to make your life better if you are living a normal life and have normal cognition. But if you want to compete in a world that makes you lactic, or if you're trying to stave off elderly decline, this looks like this is worth a look, and I would even recommend taking.
There's a lot of science that is on the horizon with this that's just at the lab phase right now. And one of the really exciting aspects that we didn't really cover in this because it hasn't moved on to the next levels of studies is that they're seeing huge benefits with stroke victims and being able to preserve the neurons that are damaged during strokes, being able to preserve those longer. So they're even talking about potentially putting it into stroke protocols. So what's coming on the horizon for beta-alanine is pretty exciting.
So in summary, let's take a look at the scorecard on this thing. So the quick summary of beta-alanine is that it shows that it actually does improve performance if you're going into high intensity physical activities. It improves cognition when you're under fatigue and stress, and potentially does improve depression and cognition in the elderly if they're below normal at baseline.
As far as downside, the only thing we could find was paresthesias. Otherwise, it's a pretty safe supplement to take.
So let's go to the scorecard. And I have to say that this gets an enthusiastic check mark on the common sense test. The mechanisms of action all fit. The actual effects that you're seeing, this isn't some magical elixir that cures your disease and then makes you beautiful and does all these different things that are unrelated. So the common sense test absolutely works for all of the mechanisms. end results that we're seeing. The evidence to back it up is excellent. It's repeated in multiple different places by dispassionate and unconflicted, investigators. And would I do it? Absolutely. This is something that if I want to get back in CrossFit or, get into hiking or any sort of intense activities, I would absolutely recommend taking it, would take it myself.
This gets a rare 3 green check marks for me for a supplement. Makes absolute sense in terms of all of the studies. Everything's congruent in terms of what it seems to make better. The level of the studies was amazing, especially for supplements. They seem to be unbiased. They were extremely well done. And would I do it if I were going lactic in any activity? I'd certainly take this supplement.
Great. So that wraps up Beta-Alanine. Stay tuned next week when we're going to tackle some other latest and greatest cure.
All right.